So we've talked a lot about the crisis in sense making on our channel. And I guess what that means is that it's increasingly difficult to make sense of the world and why that's important. And we've also had interviews with people like John Vervaeke talking about the meaning crisis. And I think that's intimately connected with the sense-making crisis. And why I think it's so important is it's very difficult to know. It seems very primary that the sense-making crisis seems to underlie a lot of the other crises that we're seeing in the world. And I know this has been a focus of yours for quite a while, and you've got quite a lot of ideas, structures, and tools to help us make sense of the sense-making crisis. So do you want to frame what you want to achieve in this conversation, what we're going to try and do?
Yeah, the meaning crisis and the sense-making crisis are obviously connected for a couple of deep reasons. What is meaningful is connected to what's real. So if I can't make sense of what's real, then I can't make choices that are aligned with what's meaningful to me. I can't even figure out what is meaningful, decoupled from the real. And what is meaningful and what is going on, right? Sense making and kind of values and meaningfulness generation both inform choice making. And so yeah, these are fundamental to all of the other issues. We can look at all of the issues facing the world today as issues of collective human choice making, because it's not the deer or the algae or anything else that is causing risks of nuclear war or economic inequality or risks associated with AI or anything else, right? These are like patterns of human choice making, which are obviously informed by both our sense making, what's going on and what do we think will happen from certain choices we make, and what are we trying to make choices in service of? What is meaningful, what is valuable, what is purposeful? I've never actually shared publicly these types of frameworks before, so this feels fun and exciting, and I hope that it's useful. As I've been trying to make sense of the world, making sense of why sense making is so hard is pretty central.
You said before that only about 10 people you think understand these frameworks. Who are those people, and are you in touch, or do you think you're aware of everyone who is aware of this?
Certainly not aware of everyone. Probably aware of more of the people than most people are, because one of the things that comes up when you're trying to make sense of complex things is you recognize that it's impossible for a single human to have the cognitive complexity, and yet you also realize that you can't offload your sense making to other people who aren't sense making well. And you realize that no one is sense making well if they don't understand the issues with sense making. And so there's an attempt to find other people that understand the issues well, to share in the understanding of those issues, so we all up-level our own sense making, so that there can be some group intelligence. And so there's definitely an attractor field of people who are interested in being able to think more clearly and feel into things more clearly. I mean, I think that's what Rebel Wisdom is an attractor field of people who are starting to be interested in what's going on. I think it's clear to probably most of your listeners that the things called news are mostly propaganda, narrative warfare for some agency, and that they aren't good sources of sense-making. And just to break that down very simply, the news is going to be transmitted by a news organization. That organization, most of the time, is a for-profit corporation within a capitalist macro economy to be able to pay for everything that it takes to actually produce news, it has to make money somehow. Most of the time it's going to make that money through selling ads. So its customer is actually the advertiser, not the consumer of the news. The advertiser is going to pay more if more people are watching it more of the time. So the goal then of the news organization for its own ability to survive is to maximize engagement. And sharing the most true stuff and maximizing engagement, there's a delta between how you do those things, right? Because there might be things that are true but boring. And there might be things that are much more detailed and complex and nuanced, and people just bail. But there are things that are more inflammatory and people are going to tune in. Then we also get, okay, well, so who are my advertisers? My advertisers might be big oil companies, they might be big pharma companies, they might be big, biotech or whatever companies. So if I share news that is directly harmful to their business, that changes public opinion with true information about things that would have those companies not do well, then those companies say, hey, information that you're sharing doesn't allow us to have the money to keep paying to advertise, so we're going to have to go work with somebody else. So now I actually can't share the news fully. Because I as an entity, the news organization can't even exist if I do that, right? So you just kind of fast forward this dynamic and you see, okay, the news organization is actually, as a company, it is an agent, right? It's an economic agent that has its own interest, that has fiduciary responsibility to maximize profit for its shareholders and to even just continue to survive and exist. And it does that by balancing that its actual customer, who it has a primary responsibility to, are the advertisers, and the advertisers want to compel the behavior through compelling the beliefs of the watchers. And we're going to do that by maximizing engagement, so it will go in the direction of short things rather than long things to appeal to attention span biases. The fact of compressing it into something short means that you'll never get nuanced views, because nuanced views take a while. You have to be able to share this perspective and this perspective and this perspective, and then see the partial truths in each of them and the distortions and how it fits together and have a dialectic and a conversation. So if I'm going to fit it into sound bites, it'll become false just by the process of not enough bit size. And if it's a little bit more scary or comforting or appeal to some emotion, it's going to work better than if it's clearer and not doing that. And so you can see this process by which there's and of course, the news stations that do that effectively will become more profitable. So there's an evolution of sharing information for strategic reasons rather than just the information that is the most true, right? Okay, so I think most of us are aware that that phenomenon happens in news. And I'm sure within this dialogue we'll get to talking about how that happens differently with larger broadcast news than smaller local news, and how it happens differently on social media where you've got AI engines optimizing time on site and those types of things. We would hope, though, that there are some sources of high signal, low noise, true information, like maybe scientific journals, like academia, science itself. I hoped this a long time ago, and I had the continuous kind of disappointment of seeing that, see things like that articles published in famous journals, peer-reviewed scientific journals like Journal of American Medical Association. 5 years later, we'll see that a major percentage of them, something like 50%, are found to be mostly inaccurate. 50% is a coin toss, right? Or we see the replication crisis, or we see that the things that get studied, even if it's true information, it can be misleading, because for the most part, where does the money to fund the research come from? It's going to come within capitalism mostly, where there's some ROI on the research, and so some areas have more ROI than others. So even a bunch of true information, but that is weighted towards certain parts of the information ecology over others, create misrepresentation through preponderance of information, right? So even a bunch of true information can create distortion. So then you start to say, oh, okay, so the essence of science within the philosophy of science, the essence of it is earnestness of inquiry, right? It's empiricism, but then earnestness of inquiry. Eddington defined science as the earnest endeavor to put into order the facts of experience. And the essence of capitalism is so you can say the essence of science is no bias, right? At least the idea, the spirit of it. We can get into where even the philosophy of science has built-in axiomatic bias later. But then in capitalism, it is about optimizing for bias, right? Like I actually have an agency that I'm trying to get ahead. I have intention to increase my balance sheet. And so if there's capital funding of science, it's going to fund the things that create ROI on that research so we can keep doing more research. That creates both a reason to distort the info and a reason to withhold information that is a source of competitive advantage, a reason to create disinfo to other competitors, and to at least wait, of course, in biotech, if I can get a patent on a synthetic molecule and I can't get a patent on a natural molecule, a lot more money is going to go into synthetic molecules and natural. And then we look at it and say, well, there's not that many phase 3 clinical trials on herbs than there are on pharma meds, so the pharma meds must be more accurate. Well, no, this is even true information. Preponderance of data is going to create problems, right? And so, I started being like, okay, I can't trust news to be true because news is narrative warfare. I can't trust science without actually really looking at what was the methodology employed, how was it funded, what were the axioms that the team was using, what were the logical transforms, am I seeing all of their data or the cherry-picked data? And as I started to kind of unfold to say, where are the high signal, low noise sources that I can offload some of the cognitive complexity of making sense of the world to, the answer is really sad, right? I don't know any sources that are very high signal and low noise across lots of areas. So then we start being like, well, why is that? And what would it take to fix that? What would it take to make a world that had an intact information ecology? Well, that requires understanding why the current information ecology is as broken as it is. And we're starting to touch on a couple things here, but this goes deep. And how do we make good choices if we don't have good sense making? Well, obviously we can't. But due to increasing technological capacity, right? Increasing population multiplied by increasing impact per person, we're making more and more consequential choices with worse and worse sense making to inform those choices, which is kind of running increasingly fast through the woods, increasingly blind, right? And so I think many of the people that you've had on Rebel Wisdom have been in a deep inquiry around how do we actually fix our own sense making. And it's some of what has brought us to have conversations with each other, because a part of how we work with our own sense making is we recognize the cognitive complexity of issues that the world faces is more than a single person can process, a single brain that can't actually hold that cognitive complexity. So it requires collective intelligence and collective sense making. But I can't just offload the cognitive complexity to some authority because I can't trust that they're actually doing good sense making. Maybe they're doing good sense making within a very limited context, but then the application of that outside of the context is different, and maybe there's even distortions within their context. So I have to try and find other people that are also really endeavoring to sense make well, which means they have to understand what causes failures in sense making. And then we have to see, can we create relationships with each other that remove the distortion basis that is normally there. So I think from what I have seen of Rebel Wisdom, this is probably the strange attractor of what is bringing everybody to watch it, is people who are trying to make sense of the world better themselves and are trying to find sources of content of other people that have been trying to make sense of it well, which is what I'm excited about. And so those are just some opening thoughts. And yeah, I look forward to getting into why we have as broken an information ecology as we have, and what it would take to correct that at scale, and how we can make sense of the world even in the broken information ecology now in terms of practical processes.
Great. Lots to dig into already. And just to break apart information ecology, you mean the whole environment of information.
Yeah.
And why is it there's a sense a lot of people have that it's getting worse. Is that mainly technology driven, or are there lots of reasons for it?
There are lots of reasons, and most of them can be connected to technology, but we actually have to kind of dive into that. So information ecology is that there's a whole ecosystem of information, right? Like we have information coming in from marketing, we have information coming in from government sources, from campaigning, from just what our neighbors tell us and our friends tell us, from social media, and we use information to make sense of the world, to make choices that are aligned with whatever our goals are and our values and what's meaningful to us. And what we hope is that the information around us is mostly true and representative of reality so that we can use that to make choices that will be effective. When I say broken information ecology, it means that we can't trust that most of the information coming in is true and representative of reality and will inform good choice making. And so then this is where we have to get into, okay, so where does information come from, right? Signals are being shared by people and by groups of people that have shared agency, like corporations and governments and political parties and religions and whatever, right? And so we want to start getting into why do people share information other than just sharing what is true and representative of reality. This is actually a really key thing to start to understand. So maybe I'll actually define something that I was just referencing, which is the difference between true and truthful. This is a first important distinction. When we say someone's being truthful, what we mean is that if you're being truthful with me, it means that what you are sharing maps to what you believe, right? That there's a correspondence between the signal that you're communicating to me and what you believe is true. So we can look at breakdowns of truthfulness, which is where people are distorting information with some intentionality. And that can either be through overt lying or through lying through omission or lying through emphasis bias, right? Those kinds of things. So that's truthful. And when we say something is true, what we typically mean, and this gets very nuanced, and we end up having to get into like fundamental epistemology, ontology, concepts of what does it mean for something to be true? What are our fundamental axioms about the nature of reality? I'll put that on hold for now and just say, in general, if we say that someone's saying something that's true, we don't just mean that there's a correspondence between what they're saying and what they think, but there's a correspondence between what they're saying and some independently verifiable reality. And so, of course, someone can be truthful, meaning they say what they believe, but what they believe is misinformed because they did sense-making poorly. So they're propagating information honestly, but that is not true. And so we need to look at distortions in both of these. There's a third thing, which is representative, which is it's possible for someone to be truthful, share exactly what they think is going on, and that what they're sharing is actually true. They've actually done good epistemology and empirically validated that what they're saying maps to reality in some clear way. And yet, the interpretation I get from that will still actually mislead me because the true information is not representative of the entire context well. So like we're mentioning in biotech, for instance, I can do studies where I say this particular medical intervention affected this biomarker. But it might be that it affected this biomarker positively, but it affected 100 other biomarkers negatively that I didn't measure. And so if I only look at that it affected this one positively, I might say, oh, it looks like it has a positive effect. And that's actually true information that is being shared truthfully that would still be misrepresentative of reality. So this is where I have to say, do I have some sense of what the actual territory is? And do I have a sense that the map that's being created actually maps onto the territory reasonably well? Because sense-making means map generation, right? To be able to make choices of how we navigate, how we do choice-making in relationships with some actual territory. So that's true, truthful, and then representative, and we can look at distortions in all three of those.
So you talked about true, truthful, and representative. What's the difference between those, and why is it important? Why is that distinction important?
So the distinction is important because breakdowns in information that we can use to inform choice making happen in all three of those domains. So we can kind of take them one at a time. So let's talk about kind of the most obvious one first, which is breakdowns in truthfulness, which is lying, right? This is something that I'm sure everyone listening to this has thought about at some point when they've noticed themselves lying. And they've noticed, okay, I actually value truthfulness. I don't want lied to, and yet I'm saying that I'm busy to someone when it's really not that. I just don't want to see them, right? I'm telling little lies and I'm rationalizing why that's okay. Or bigger lies, right? Or simply omitting information. And then we're like, how many people are omitting information that I would care about for me? And so I think probably everyone has encountered, I can trust relationships to the degree that, several things, but one of the key is to the degree that I trust them actually being truthful with me. And truthful not just in terms of that they aren't intentionally lying and distorting information, but that there's also some meaningful degree of transparency. Because if there's simply very significant stuff withheld, right? Like if a partner is cheating and not overtly lying, just withholding it, we're like, oh, that matters, right? So when you start to explore, what are all of the reasons that people distort information? What are all the reasons that they lie? And what about individual people in relationship with each other? And as soon as you start realizing that there is some degree of lack of truthfulness, probably in almost all of your closest relationships, meaning like, is there anyone with whom I'm 100% transparent? And for most people, the answer is no. Or if the answer is yes, it's with very few people. And you're like, okay, well, if there's some degree of non-truthfulness in the closest relationships that I claim to trust the most, then what about the not closest relationships, right? Like in the extended community. And then what about relationships that actually have some rivalry associated, like marketing relationships? And then as we start to get into institutions, right, the institution has similar bases to distort information that people have. So when we look at why does an individual distort information, the most fundamental way of thinking about it is there's this idea in terms of signaling. Like if I'm just in nature watching, and I'm watching what is happening with rabbits and trees and birds, I'm getting information about them that they aren't even intending to transmit. And so the information is just reflective, right? Light's actually reflecting off of them, of the nature of reality. As soon as there's an agent that can share information strategically for an intention, then I don't know if what they're sharing is reflective of reality or reflective of what they think will advance their intention. And that's kind of the key distinction, is that the moment we get abstract signaling, which language allows us, and the ability to kind of forecast and our ability to model each other, and your well-being and the basis of your agency doesn't seem coupled with my well-being and the basis of my agency perfectly. In the case of the partner wanting to cheat and get away with it, right, there's a decoupling of well-being and agency. In the case of if I'm a marketer of a product and I want you to purchase it, whether my product is actually the best product or not, whether a competitor's product is better, whether you need the product or not, I want you to think that you need it and to think that mine is the best, right? So there's a breakdown between what seems to be in my well-being and what seems to be in your well-being. So wherever there's any misalignment in agency, and there's the ability to share signal for strategic purposes, then you have a basis to have signal that's being shared that isn't just truthful, right? So then we look at, well, where is that happening? And it's fucking everywhere, right? To really gross or subtle degrees, pretty much everywhere. And sometimes for dreadful purposes, like, I mean, you got the prosaic purposes, which are basically market-type dynamics, which most of the dynamics in the world are market dynamics, or at least influenced by market dynamics, right? Market dynamics are fundamentally, at least partially, if not mostly, rivalrous. Meaning my balance sheet can get ahead independent of your balance sheet getting ahead, and definitely independent of the commons, right? And so in a market-type dynamic, I'm going to be sharing information, and this is why buyer beware. But buyer beware is not just, check to make sure that the car isn't about to break down. it's also check to make sure that the information shared is being true, because if I'm actually sharing information as a service, right, and you're purchasing that information, whether you're paying for it with your attention that's being monetized through an ad, or you're paying for it directly or whatever, there's nothing that says I'm sharing true and truthful information. So in market type dynamics, the goal of marketing is that there is, say, as a company, and from the supply side of supply and demand dynamics, the goal is to compel the purchaser's action in a particular way, which means as a company, I want to do sense making for you because I want to control your choice making. I at least want to influence your choice making. I'm not actually interested in your sovereignty, and I'm not even that interested in your quality of life. I'm interested in you thinking that I'm interested in your quality of life. I'm interested in you believing that my stuff will affect your quality of life. But whether that actually corresponds or not, I don't care. In fact, if I can sell you food that is very addictive, or cigarettes, or social media, or porn, or whatever it is, that actually decreases your baseline happiness, but then makes you need another hit faster and is addictive, that's really good for lifetime revenue of a customer. And to the degree that my fiduciary responsibility is to maximize profitability for me and my shareholders, and so I need to maximize lifetime revenue of my customers multiplied by maximizing the customer base, addiction is the most profitable thing I can get, right? Where that's never in the best interest of the customer. Now, as a corporation where I get to employ a whole bunch of people to do market research and to split test ads and to see what works best and to use psychological insights and to be thinking about your choice making more than you're thinking about your choice making, not only is the information I'm sharing with you not just truthful, and it's a form of kind of narrative warfare because we're agents that are actually competing for what you do, right? I want you to do something in particular, you want to do what's best for you, those aren't the same thing. But it's actually an asymmetric warfare because I have a lot more ongoing team and focus now, especially as you start to look at a big corporation empowered by AI and big data and et cetera. It's radically asymmetric info warfare that you don't even know is happening, right? You don't even know you're engaged in. So we can see that, but all the way down to the little guy in a market, right, who's just peddling wares. His incentive is to compel people to buy the thing, not to really adequately inform them that he just marked the price up a lot from where he got it down the way, and if they go down the way off the beaten path, like the other stuff is better. And so this is ubiquitous, right? Okay. And then as we're exploring reasons that people share things that are not fully truthful and representative, there are of course things worse than this. This is, I would say, most of where the distortion comes from, is agency misalignment. Well, it's always agency misalignment, right? Mostly we'll call that market, but any sources where you have some agent, whether it's a company or a country or a person that can think about their own well-being independent of the well-being of other agents and or the commons, then there's a basis for them to optimize their well-being with some externality. In the same way we externalize cost to the environment, we can externalize a cost to the information environment. An externalized cost to the information environment is like disinformation is pollution to the information ecology, right? That's a kind of a good way of thinking about it. And as ubiquitous as pollution is, where we see that the snow on the top of Mount Everest is full of pollution, right? Of many different kinds, I would say information ecology pollution is more ubiquitous because it's not just big industrial players doing it, it's everybody doing it, and you can't even see it as clearly. But even people will create distortions in information for seemingly positive reasons. Like, first there's kind of innocuous reasons, like, okay, I'm going to write a testimonial or an endorsement for my friend's book because they're my friend. Even though I think there's stuff wrong in their book, it wouldn't be that gracious of me to say that. And maybe there's some game theoretic stuff in there, like they wrote a nice testimonial for my book and I want them to keep doing that. And so my giving the endorsement of my whatever credibility that other people proxy their sense making to me, I'm now, proxying that credibility over here is not necessarily true. Even if it's not that they did the endorsement on my book and I just am supportive of them taking a positive step, that doesn't necessarily mean that anyone else who sees that I offered that testimonial and is using that as a method of their own sense-making knows why I did it. So here's the other thing, is a decoupling of the signal that I'm sharing with the intention that I'm sharing it for. And so I might be sharing something with you, and I have 4 or 5 complex intentions. I might not share any of them with you, or maybe I share one, right? Maybe I share some information about the environment, and I imply that my intention is to help the environment. But my intention might also be to get popularity for a future political office run, or to get more views for something I'm going to market in the future, or simply to get attention or whatever else. And I might be manipulating the way I'm sharing the information for those purposes. And if you don't understand what my intents are, then there's no way for you to factor that. So as far as truthfulness goes, one of the first things that people can do is to think about whoever's sharing information, so let's say we're talking about campaigning, right? In terms of information that would come from a representative. That there's an obvious basis to share things that are compelling people's behavior. So in a market type dynamic, obviously we're trying to compel behavior. In a government type dynamic, since it's a collective coordination system, we're also trying to compel people's behavior. So if I run for office, I'm going to say certain things, and then I'm going to do different things when I get in. Everyone has come to expect that, because my goal is not to share true things. It's to compel your behavior to get me put into a position that is advantageous for me. Now, I might rationalize, I want to do good things. I really want to help the country or the state, and I want to do good things. The population is dumb enough that if I share what I want to do, they won't really be able to understand it. So I'm going to share what I need to share with them to get in so I can do authentically good things. So even if I'm well-intended, right, I might have a source where I think that the misinformation is actually a valuable thing to do, but there's nothing that says I'm actually right about that. And so when you're getting information from a news channel and you're like, oh, this news channel wants to maximize my time on site, and it can do that through appealing to my cognitive biases and my emotional biases and my identity biases. It can do that through things that are inflammatory. It can do that through all kinds of things that are hypernormal stimulus and that hijack my attention. This is where it's competing for my attention against where I would want to put my attention, because it's monetizing my attention, right? So I have to factor the agency, the intention of the news station, and try and remove that artifact from the information to try and infer what the true information might be. Basically to infer what the source of distortion might be. The same with the political candidate, the same with science that's coming forward, and I'm looking at, okay, so who is seeking more grant funding, and what is easiest to fund? And where are their standard model biases, where only the things, people are only going to share the shit that's going to get them more funding and that's going to get tenure, where they have to defend the thing that got them the Nobel Prize, even though it might not be true anymore, for ego and identity biases. You've got to factor all of those kinds of sources of possible bias. And so this is the first, I would say, kind of valuable thing when you're trying to do sense making, is to recognize that the signal that you're getting everywhere is mostly strategic. Strategic on the part of, which is just another way to say intentional, on the part of the agent sharing it for their purposes, not yours. And where there is a disalignment between your well-being and theirs, or at least an apparent one, then what their basis for intention might actually suck for you. And even if there seems to be alignment, you still don't want lied to for your good. You still want true information. So I would say one of the first things we want to do when we start to do sense making is to look at, why is anyone sharing what they're sharing? And not assuming that they are being truthful.
That's one of the 3. Are we going to double click on the other 2?
Sure. So true. So basically, truthful is about game theory. right? Truthful is about the fact that people are lying all the fucking time. And okay, we're actually going to say a little bit more about that one before we move on. When you're playing poker, you learn how to bluff, because it's not who has the best hand that wins. It's who makes everyone else think that they have the best hand, and right, there's a lot that goes on in that. And so because it's a zero-sum game, right? That if my win does not equal your win, my win is going to equal some other player's losses, then I have an incentive to disinform you, where information about reality is a source of competitive advantage. Like, this is actually the real kind of key way of thinking about it, because disinformation even happens in nature with other animals. Right? You'll see a caterpillar that evolved to have something on its tail that looks like a head to disinform birds so that they go to peck at the false head and it might still be able to live, right? Like, that's actually an evolved disinformation strategy. And it's just that the disinformation in nature happens very slowly, and where the selective pressures on the side of the caterpillar and the bird are co-evolving, right? So the bird is getting better at noticing those things as the caterpillar is getting better at dealing with that. Camouflage is a kind of disinformation, right? It's an attempt to not signal something fully, because there's rivalrous dynamics between the caterpillar and the bird in that scenario. But with people, with our abstract replicators, we can create the distortion much, much, much faster. We can have asymmetries in the capacity to create the distortion, and even exponential asymmetries. And so it's actually really quite different. So you think about the poker bluff, and you think about, like, even in soccer or football, when someone fakes left and then goes right, that's a disinformation strategy, where if we're competing and information about the nature of reality, where the water is, where the gold is, what the market is going to do next, if this company is going to make it, whatever, equals a source of advantage, but we're an assumed rivalrous dynamic, we're competing for the same money, competing for the same attention, whatever, then first I have the incentive to withhold information, right? So I don't want to tell you where the gold is, or I don't want you to know the intellectual property that I'm going to monetize. Simply the withholding of information fucks up the information ecology so much, because I'm doing cancer research and I've had some big breakthroughs, but I'm not trying to share that with everyone else who's doing cancer research, because this is being funded by a for-profit process that needs to be able to monetize that through intellectual property, right? And so we can see how much problem happens as a result of withholding of information, but we can also see how intractable this problem seems within a game theoretic environment like capitalism, right? I keep saying capitalism. I'm not going to say that any other bad economic system we've ever tried is the answer, because they aren't. We have basis for disinformation in communism and socialism and fascism. We're going to suggest that new structures that have not ever happened are needed. I'm just wanting to say that here so people don't attach to me criticizing capitalism is probably going to suggest something that doesn't work. So the first thing is withholding information. And we see in business how much focus is on IP and NDAs and, you know, those types of things. But then it's not simply withholding information, it's also disinforming, right? Just like the poker bluff or the fake left and go right, we have and we can see in warfare, we try and have black projects where we withhold the information because we don't want the other side to know what our military capacities are, but we also try to disinform what our military capacities are, or where we're going to attack, or whatever else, as a source of advantage. And that's been happening forever. Sun Tzu writes about that, right? I mean, it's just, we've had a basis for disinformation for a long time. We've had rivalrous dynamics for a long time. The rivalrous dynamics are a basis by which we can get ahead by war and killing somebody else, or lying to them, right? Or ruining the commons. It's just exponential tech leads to, with those same incentives, leads to exponential disinformation, exponential extraction, exponential pollution, exponentially scaled warfare, and on a finite playing field, that self-destructs. So the underlying cause is the same stuff that's been happening, but at a speed and scope and scale and level of complexity that forces us to have to actually deal with the underlying structures now, because they can't continue. Okay, so that's the game theoretic side of it. Now, what would it take to have an intact information ecology where any information that anyone had, just on the truthfulness side, was being shared, that there was no incentive for disinformation? First, let's just imagine that, right? Like, no disinformation. Let's give some other examples of disinformation. There's not just where I'm intentionally trying to mislead you. There's also where I'm sharing signal for some purpose for me that might mislead you, and I'm not intending to, I just don't care if I do. So let's say I want some increased attention. And this might be because I'm going to monetize that attention, might be because I'm going to get political power, might be simply because I just want attention, right? So let's say I comment on what some famous person is doing. Let's say I disagree with them. I'm instantly going to get some attention if I critique them effectively that I didn't necessarily earn, and I don't even have to believe the critique, because via association of that type, I'm going to get some attention. So now people have a basis to focus on something they weren't focused on before, to criticize it because that will get attention, or to compliment it, or to play off of it in a way that is not actually what they care about or believe. And again, you look at how ubiquitous it is, that kind of phenomenon. All right. So the answer to getting over the truthfulness issue is actually a post-game theoretic world, which is the same answer as, like, how do we get past warfare? Well, it's not just kinetic warfare where we throw bombs or rocks at each other. It's also info warfare and narrative warfare and economic warfare, right? Which is basically any in-group that is coordinating to compete against an out-group in some kind of zero-sum dynamic. And that's companies to companies, it's companies to people, it's people to people, it's countries to countries, it's global economic trading blocks with each other, it's all of those things. What can people do right now within a game theoretic world to start to create spaces of truthfulness? Start to create relationships where one of the highest values is truthfulness with other people that are capable of and want and are committed to that, where people are not only not lying to each other, but they are endeavoring to not withhold information, which is tremendous intimacy and tremendous vulnerability. And see if you can create enough psychological safety with some people to be able to start exploring what does it mean to actually share information honestly, so that we can have that and all kind of make sense together. That's one thing. And there's also something where it's like, if you don't throw trash out the window of your car because you don't pollute the environment, be careful about not polluting the information ecology by rationalizing why your own mis or disinformation is okay. And just start to think of it that way. Think of any time you're sharing little lies as polluting the information ecology and being like, oh, wow, I don't want to do that. I don't want to be part of the fucked up information ecology. Okay, so now on the true side, which is not just a mapping or a correspondence between what I'm saying and what I think, but between what I'm saying and what shared reality is, which means there has to be a correspondence between what I think and reality. That means I had to do sense making well before I share something, right? So this is the topic of epistemology. So one is movement past game theory. The next is epistemology. How do we know stuff? So even if nobody was lying and withholding information, the complexity of the world makes epistemology hard. And most people aren't even endeavoring at it. So if no one was lying and I could take all the information as at least truthful, there would be certain epistemic processes that I could apply that I can't apply if I can't even take the sources of signal as being signal without a lot of noise, right? So there's epistemology that I have to have within the context of an environment that has a lot of disinformation. How do I make sense of what is true and what isn't true? about signal coming in, and then how do I parse from lots of signal what might be true about reality. And for, like, to just get a sense of why, like, how big a deal this is. You take any of the biggest issues in the world, like the issues that could determine whether or not we keep existing as a species. Okay, so take big environmental issues like climate change. There's disagreement as to whether climate change is really even a thing. And to the extent that it is a thing, what the causes are and what the timescales are. Now, most people who believe fervently, no, climate change is real, 97% of climate scientists agree, it's anthropogenic, greenhouse gases, etc. Most of the people that believe that fervently enough to kind of like go into narrative warfare for it have never actually looked at the primary data deeply themselves. And yet there's an almost religious fervor around it that was based on having proxied their sense-making to people who they believe. So the UN said it, or the Gates Foundation said it, or the whatever it is. I've heard it repeated enough times that just through repeatability, like, I have been programmed to believe this thing is true, which is not that different than believing a fundamentalist religious idea, right? And let's say we take people's fervent ideas on vaccines, or their fervent ideas on the viability of market ideology, or almost anything like that. Almost no one who has fervent ideas has a good epistemic basis for the level of certainty they hold. There's a decoupling between how much certainty they have and how much certainty they should have through right process. And then you look at who are they proxying their sense-making to, and most of the time they're not even proxying their sense-making to the people who did the original research. Many of whom disagree with each other and were funded by somebody to say something that is not fully true in the first place, and who maybe were employing epistemic biases themselves. But typically it's somebody else who looked at all of that, and then someone else who looked at all of that. So you might have like a bunch of climate scientists into someone who is speaking about that as a climate scientist at a more synthetic level, like a James Hansen or whatever, to then like a Gore or someone who is actually speaking to the public, who we're proxying our sense-making to. And we say, okay, how many steps removed is it, and how good was the original data? And so if we think about, okay, how much radiation actually was released into the environment from Fukushima? It seems like a very straightforward thing. Take a Geiger counter and go out and do the studies. But how many people are equipped to take a Geiger counter out and go do that? Or to be able to actually pay attention to how the flow dynamics in the air and the water are going to work, or, you know, so many things. And so we have to take other people's data to begin with, and those other people, let's say the data was the Japanese government or TEPCO or whoever it was, or a conspiracy theory group that is saying, no, it's actually releasing huge amounts of ocean and all the fish are totally toxified, but they might just be, they have a basis to disinform because they're getting viewership that they're monetizing through that. How the fuck do we make sense of it, right? So what we start to get is, it's like, is AI going to solve a bunch of problems and be relatively safe, or is AI the biggest risk and going to kill us? And you see kind of fervent disagreement, but you see us still pedal to the metal, going as fast forward as we can with AI, and with CRISPR, biotech, and with every type of exponential technology that could be catastrophic. And so there's increasing speed of choice making with decreasing sense making. Right? And so to just think about, like, okay, or even what's really going on with the Chinese government and its cyber warfare relationship with the US government, and with kind of the what its actual capacities are and what its intent and agency is, and those types of issues. Well, we know that's going to be obscured. We know both sides, and all kinds of sides are going to be obscuring information. And it gets even worse, because it's not just that you've got this group of people called China and this group of people called the US, and that they're in a game theoretic relationship with each other, but everybody on Team USA cooperates perfectly. No, of course it's not that, right? So even within the intelligence agencies, I might have two different intelligence agencies that are supposed to be cooperating, but they're competing for a bigger percentage of the black budget. And so they might be withholding information from each other or even disinforming each other. Then I might have two agents within an agency competing for the same promotion who might run disinfo on each other. So I have fractal disinformation, right, at almost every place because of a game theoretic incentive system, which is the balance sheet of countries, the balance sheet of organizations, the balance sheet of all the way down to individual people, right? The separation of agency. So now I'm back to the game theory truthfulness side, but I have to factor that when I'm trying to make sense of things because I have to be able to parse signal from noise to then be able to synthesize the signal. But then, even if that wasn't the case, I'm just trying to do epistemology on good signal. Then I have to say, okay, in a complex system, like where we can't even forecast the weather 10 days out very well, how do I forecast the effect of putting certain kinds of pesticides or genetically modified organisms or whatever into the environment, right? It's a complex system that we can't forecast very well at all. We don't know the tiniest bit of the actual information of how that complex system is going to regulate, but we're going to do stuff that affects those systems at scale. What is the right epistemology to be able to make sense of? Is this a good choice? And so you can see, and what are all the metrics we have to factor? Let's say we're talking about biotech. Okay, so I can give you a drug that is good for some biometric that happens to be associated with a disease that I'm trying to get the doctors to be able to use this drug allowed by the FDA to treat a particular disease. And since the disease is identified by this biomarker, I have to affect this biomarker. So let's say I'm talking about high cholesterol, and so we develop a statin for it. How many other metrics is the statin affecting? Well, every day we're learning new biometrics we didn't even know existed. How many of those are being affected that are part of the unknown set that we don't even know to be able to do risk calculation on? Now, we could say, well, let's run the experiment long enough before we release the drug to see if it affects total longevity and all-cause mortality. Well, nobody fucking does that. Nobody's going to run 100-year experiments on something before they release the thing. They're going to run the shortest ones they can. So where you have a system that has delayed causation, how do I know if that's creating problems way down the road? Well, it does all the time, right? So we get rid of DDT or parathion or malathion because we see that it's super poisonous after we've been spraying it on everybody. And then we bring in a new drug that we also didn't do long-term studies on. I mean, a new pesticide. And then we outlaw it after a little while, and then we bring in a new one. The new ones aren't safer. They just haven't had as much time to show how dangerous they are. So then the question is like, what would the right epistemology be? How many metrics do I have to factor? How do I know how to factor those metrics? What is the total information complexity of the scenario relative to how much the information complexity of the assessment that we've done? So we can get into at some depth the topic of appropriate epistemology for various contexts. But I guess the first thing I can say is that if people aren't even thinking about that, their chance of making sense well is pretty close to zero.
Daniel, why do bad ideas catch on?
So if we think about the concept of a meme, the way that Dawkins originally put it forward, it's an abstract pattern replicator, where a gene is an instantiated pattern replicator, which means that it can mutate and change and affect behavior and propagate much, much, much faster, right? And we can kind of say that in Homo sapiens, our genetics selected for mimetics, for higher order mimetics, right? Our genetics, because most other species, what the selective pressures had them be adaptive to an environment, right? There's mutation, and then the mutations that survive and mate the best are the ones that make it through. But that's within the context of survive in that environment and are able to mate successfully in that environment. So they become more and more fit to their environment. So the cheetah does really well in the savannah. It would not do well in the Arctic, and the polar bear wouldn't do well in the savannah, and the orca wouldn't do well outside of the ocean, right? Like, so they are well adapted to their environment. Because of our abstraction capacity, which is both our capacity for language and memes as well as tools, we were able to go and become adaptive, become actually apex predators in the savannah and in the Arctic and in the ocean and everywhere, right? We were able to go to every environment, which means that as soon as our population would normally, if we were any other animal, start to level off in relationship with the environmental carrying capacity of an environment, we just moved. We were able to decimate that environment and move to the next one, right? Into all of them. And then, but that part isn't the part I want to get into right now. It's that since we were going to be adaptive to totally new environments, and since we were going to create tools where what it was to be adaptive was changing, since we modify our environment in ways that the other animals don't. We can't come in genetically fit to a specific environment. We have to come in and be able to imprint the environment that we're in so we know how to be fit to totally different environments. Because like, it's not that adaptive for us to throw spears or even climb trees all that well, but it is to be able to like text and drive and stuff that wouldn't have been adaptive 1,000 years ago at all. And so this is why human babies are embryonic or neotenous for so long, right, compared to any other animal. And if you, like, the thing I like to do here is to think about a horse standing up in like 20 minutes and a human being able to walk in like a year. And just think about how many 20-minute segments multiply into a year to get a sense of how much longer we are helpless than anything else is. And even amongst the other primates close to us, there's really nothing like us in terms of the extended helplessness, and that's because we don't have inherited knowledge of how to be us. Since the environment is going to be different, we have to imprint the environment that we're in to be able to be adaptive to environments that we're changing, right? So this is us saying that our genetics selected for neuroplasticity, selected for mimetics, our hardware selected for faster software updates that could have faster changes in adaptive basis so that we could move our environments and all those types of things. So if we think about a meme kind of like a gene as a pattern replicator, but as an abstract pattern replicator that can mutate much quicker, there's also a big difference is that the other animals are, in an environment, the mutation across genes is very evenly distributed. Mutations happening to the gazelles and to the cheetahs at an equal rate, right? And there's co-selective pressures on both of them. So they're both getting faster. The slowest ones of each are dying off. And so there's this kind of symmetry of power that has the competitive pressures between them have them all up level. But when we start being mostly mimetic, and the other species are still mostly genetic, meaning we're getting adaptive based on abstract pattern replicators, they're still instantiated pattern replicators, we can increase our predative capacity much faster than they can increase than the environment can increase its resilience to our predative capacity, which means that we can debase the whole substrate that we depend upon, which is self-terminating, right? You can't keep debasing that which you depend upon. So in evolution, there is a selection process for the genes that make it through, right? But there is this kind of symmetry of the genes that make it through because of the evenness of mutation and because of the co-selective pressures. Now with mimetics, the memes that make it through are the memes that win in a rivalrous context, not the ones that necessarily represent the true or the good or the beautiful. So the propagative memes propagate more than the true memes propagate. This is a super important concept to understand, which is, like, I was always dumbfounded thinking about the evolution of religions. You take Christianity, for instance, and you say, okay, so Jesus, when they brought Mary Magdalene, said, let he who has no sins amongst you cast the first stone, right? And then when they're nailing him up, he says, Father, forgive them, for they know not what they do. And he's like bringing forgiveness to Judaism. And in his name, we did the Crusades and the Inquisition and said, we will not just kill, but torture anyone who doesn't accept the Lord of Peace as their... Like, how the fuck did we do that? How did we do the mental gymnastics to take the guy whose key teachings were forgiveness and torture people in the name of that? Well, we figured out how to do it, right? But the key is it was super adaptive. So you've got an idea, right? Say you've got Jesus' teachings, or we can take it in any of them. And then there's going to be a bunch of mutations on that idea, different interpretations of it. Some of the mutations say, be quiet and don't push your ideas on anyone. Be contemplative and etc. And those ones don't catch on because they aren't being intentionally propagated. And other ones say, go out and propagate these ideas on missions and on crusades and focus on not the forgiveness parts, but on the like wrath and Leviticus and who God's enemies were. Like focus on those parts. And that you actually get better spots in heaven for converting more people, right? And so what you end up getting is that the ideas that catch on are the ones that win in narrative warfare. But they're having to catch on, so then say Islam is also competing for some of the same people, right? Because ultimately the religions become the bases of in-groups that are competing against out-groups for fundamentally political and economic and survival type bases. So I can hold people together with a political left or political right ideology, or a capitalist communist ideology, or a racial identity ideology, or religious ideologies. All of those become the basis of an in-group that can bind together to be more successful in competition with assumed out-groups, right? But what that means is that rivalrous game theoretic environment is going to be selecting for what is effective at rivalry, not what is true. And definitely not what is good for the whole. And the moment that anybody figures something out that is more effective at rivalry, then everybody else reverse engineers it and creates similar mimetic mutations on other sides. And so there's not that many Janes, right? They're lovely people, right? And totally nonviolent and aren't going to hurt anybody, but they're also not pushing their ideas on anybody. So the ideas aren't spreading that fast. So the ideas that have an artificial focus on the spreading of ideas and that figure out how to emotionally manipulate people into believing the idea with heaven and hell and whatever, right, are going to spread more. So this is a key thing to get is, whether we're taking, it's not just, right, I'm giving the example of the teachings of Jesus turning into the Crusades or the Inquisition, but it's also take thinking like Darwin, right? So take the context in which Darwin came about. Darwin came about just following Malthus, right? So we got the British Empire's first kind of real world ruling empire. First time that a global inventory of resources was ever conducted. Malthus came up with the fundamental principle of scarcity or inadequacy that says, hey, people are reproducing geometrically, resources reproduce arithmetically, there's not going to be enough for everybody, not everybody's going to make it. Well, then who's going to make it? Fuck. That idea says compassion is not viable. We can't all make it. Fundamentally, mathematically, there aren't the resources for it. Now, this is gibberish, actually, today, because we know that populations don't reproduce exponentially forever. They steady state, and we've already seen the population in Japan and in Denmark and in other, like the most economically successful countries start decreasing, right? And we also know that we can recycle resources. We don't have to just have a linear materials economy where we use them up and turn them into trash. And that completely fundamentally changes the underlying scarcity basis. We can also share resources in different ways. So the underlying thinking behind Malthus isn't true, but he didn't know that at the time. It seemed quite compelling. So then we say, okay, so fuck, a solution for everyone, a world that works for all is not even viable. Those who want it are simply not facing up to reality. And so if not everyone's going to make it, who's going to? And so then Darwin comes out in that context. And so the idea of survival of the fittest is the idea we focus on the most, even though that's not an idea that he emphasized early in the writing hardly at all, right? And so there was, again, taking Darwin's idea in one context and then also taking the most propagated version of it that led to social Darwinism that basically reified institutional sociopathy, right? Which is, okay, well, if not everybody's going to make it, some people are going to be like predators, other people are going to be like prey. Predators don't feel bad when prey die. You have to actually cull the herd sometimes. Like and if you start to think about how hierarchical power structures work, to get to the top of a hierarchical power structure, like a big corporation or a government or a religion that's structured that way. Let's leave that one off for a moment, just say corporation or government. I have to win at a lot of win-lose games. I have to get the promotion over or win at the campaign over other people. We're zero-sum. Somebody wins, somebody loses, right? So the top is going to be people who are best at winning at win-lose games. So it's actually going to, so if I have a lot of empathy and I actually care about other people's loss, I'm going to do less well. If I'm a sociopath and don't give a shit about it, I'm going to do better at that. If I'm willing to disinform to get ahead, I'll do better at it. So this is why we see higher percentage of sociopaths and psychopaths as CEOs than in the normal distribution of population, which also means that the people who have the most influence in the world are asymmetrically empowered and asymmetrically sociopathic. But the way that we interpreted Darwin was reifying that as a reasonable thing and even a good thing. So we have to recognize that any idea, even if it started as true or good or beautiful, gets put into the game theoretic mill, right? And what propagates is the thing that's propagated. So why do bad ideas catch on? Like, largely for this reason. So oftentimes, the best ideas are not well marketed and aren't even easily marketable. And the best marketed ideas that are going to catch on the most are not that true and produce shitty results. So this is, again, something that people have to really pay attention to is, I think Jordan, in one of his interviews with you, talked about the difference between real thinking and simulated thinking. So if I'm just taking memes that I've heard and in a conversation and I'm listening for which of the things I'm going to say that I have heard somewhere else, I'm basically a meme propagator. It's not real thinking, right? I'm not actually endeavoring to try to make sense of the world in a new way that I've never done before. Most people hear a meme that comes in, and because it's from Fox, they believe it or don't believe it, or because it's from CNN or whatever it is, they believe it or don't believe it. So they basically have some cluster of memes that creates like a mimetic immune system that says which ideas to accept and which ones to reject, and then once it's accepted them, propagates them. That's not thinking, and there's no sovereignty in that. And groups that have asymmetric meme broadcast capacity are good at making memes that are sticky, customized to specific audiences, and being able to split test uptake, right? And then being able to, then you get into high-tech things like Facebook, and it's like, okay, I can actually pay attention to what you click on and do profoundly deep analytics. I can pay attention to mouse hover. I can pay attention to all these types of analytics and customize the disinformation to everybody using the kind of AI that beats the best chess players in the world at chess. Right? This is stuff that Tristan Harris talks about. And so the AI that beats Kasparov at chess easily, nobody is as good at being strategic with themselves as Kasparov is at chess, and we don't even know that we're engaged in that, and yet it's competing with us for our attention for its purpose of maximize time on site. Now, it just happens to be that I'm going to scroll and bounce unless something catches my attention. Short things will catch my attention more because I'm in a hurry. So just the orientation for small bit size makes everyone more fundamentalists with shittier attention spans. And then if the headline is more kind of sensational, it's going to attract attention more. So then we get these big platforms that don't want to make people fundamentalists or drive politics, but they do simply as a byproduct of the fact that limbic hijacks are sticky and they're optimizing for time on site.
That point about sort of social media, I think it'd be great to unpack in more depth, sort of, because I think it's a really important point to frame as a standalone piece. What is it about the social media platforms that seem to be making all of this worse? And is it by design or is it accidental?
So I did a dialogue with Tristan Harris about this a while ago. It's like a couple hours. If people want to go in depth, they can check it out. But a couple key things. I'll refer to Facebook, but Instagram and Google and Apple and Amazon, like there's elements in all of these platforms to these types of dynamics. The first thing is that when I'm interacting with the platform, it is actually an agent, and I don't recognize that it's an agent. I think that it's a tool, right? And I'm used to using tools like hammers and refrigerators and even computers that don't have their own agency with respect to me. And Facebook looks like a communication tool, or it's just there for me to post stuff and to read stuff, right? And Google looks like that, except it is actually a company. It's the front face of a company that has an agency to maximize its own revenue and profit and those types of things. And it has an agency with respect to me because it's making that profit based on what I do. And I can do some things that are more profitable to it than other things. So it has an agency with respect to me, and I don't even realize that. I think of it as an inanimate tool, and it is actually a agentic entity. That's a big deal to get, right? And so then I'm sharing information about me with it that it can use to control me, to influence me for its agency, and I don't recognize that that's happening. So there's a few big issues here. One is, so let's just say I'm scrolling a newsfeed. But what I click on, if it can do statistical analysis on lots of click patterns, it can pay attention to if I click more on things based on fonts, based on colors, based on types of languaging, based on who shared it, based on, right, like heaps of stuff. And it does do those kinds of analytics. Well, that's shit about me that I don't know about me. That's actually a big deal, that it's going to know shit about me that I don't, and then it's going to optimize the newsfeed, not based on what I want in my newsfeed, but based on what's going to maximize my time on site. Now, we know that most people feel happier when they spend less time on site and more time with other human beings and in nature and in the world. So right away, there's a rival risk basis for their goal is to maximize my time on site. My goal is to find the information I want to get the fuck off site, right? And we actually see quite a lot of statistical correlation of more time on site corresponds to like more loneliness, shittier relationships, more eating disorders and body dysmorphia and all those types of things. So simply its time on site maximization, fiduciary responsibility is definitely rival risk with respect to me, but it's gathering information about how to control my attention that I don't have about me at a kind of AI asymmetric warfare level. That's a big deal, right? But then I also, it's not just the click patterns, it's also I write stuff. I purchase stuff. I write on Messenger to my friends and to people who I trust. But on Messenger, there's this man-in-the-middle type dynamic that whatever I'm sharing with my wife, whatever I'm sharing with my lawyer, my therapist, my whatever it is over there, I'm also sharing with the platform, which is intermediating my communication. And so it doesn't only have all of this information with me, about me, that I didn't think I was consenting to share, and as an agent, or I didn't even recognize it as an agent. It has the privileged information that I would share with all of my other privileged relationships that I engage with on that platform. So it has a level of information privilege that nobody has. Now, if I share sensitive information about myself, I usually share it with someone who I trust I'm sharing it with them for them to help me, not otherwise. So their agency is aligned with mine. This is what a fiduciary responsibility relationship is. So if I'm sharing it with the lawyer, there's this principal-agent issue where I'm the principal, they're an agent on my behalf. I'm going to share information with them where they're in a fiduciary relationship with me to use that information in my interest, not in theirs. It's not always how it happens, right? But that's the idea. If I'm sharing information with a priest in a confessional or a therapist, it's supposed to be that there's an asymmetry in the share of information. The therapist's not sharing that much information back, so that's because they're helping me. They're not using that for their own agency. But if I was sharing this stuff with the priest in confessional, and then they were sharing it with the salesman to tell how to optimize sales for me or to whatever else, like that'd be fucked up. There should be something like a fiduciary relationship that Facebook has with its users, or that any of the platforms have, because we're sharing privileged information. But then it's being used in a game theoretic relationship with us rather than in a fiduciary relationship. So there is something that should be a principal-agent issue, but a violation of principal-agent issue. That's the first thing, right? That there is actually a game theoretic dynamic that isn't known, and radical asymmetry in it. Now, there was radical asymmetry in, say, broadcast.
By game theoretic, you mean exploitative?
Rivalrous, yeah. It has its own agency. It has its own intent that is different than our intent, but entangled with it. right? So it wants us to behave in certain ways that are good for it, that are different than how we want to behave. That's what we mean by game theoretic. Okay. So if we think about broadcast news before Google and Facebook and those types of things, then we see the same types of issues, right? Of course, they can't share information that's bad for their advertisers, and they have to share stuff that maximizes time on site, so it's going to move in a direction of inflammatory and entertaining and engaging kind of stuff. The news agencies will have to be competing with each other for attention, so there will be this game theoretic up-ratcheting of stickiness techniques. So we see all of that, right? And that they can invest tremendously more time and money and skill and expertise in paying attention to our attention than we do. But at least they have to pay attention to, they're optimizing for a bell curve distribution on a very wide audience, right? And the amount of interaction is not that much. It's just, do I change the channel or not, right? So they basically get time on site and bounce rate, but like not that much else. Now, they can start to get smarter and say, okay, this audience, this info is sticky for, and this audience, this stuff is sticky for. So now I can get a news conglomerate who behind the scenes actually owns a far right and a far left news station, because at this level, right and left are just the ways that you control the stupid masses, right? Like, okay, this group of stupid masses identifies this way. It really just to be part of an in-group and to proxy sense making, to deal with the cognitive complexity of the world and to feel a false sense of certainty that they didn't earn through good epistemic process. And okay, and this group identifies with this set of memes, and neither of them actually did their homework at all, right? Or well enough. So I can at least start getting multiple different news stations to have a bell curve across smaller audiences where the conglomerate is doing that thing. And that happened, right? But then with social media, it gets much better because I get n equals 1 optimization with much deeper interaction. Because now it's not just, do you stay on site or leave? It's, do you like it? Do you share the info? Do you comment on it? How many people do you share it with? How much time do you spend reading it? How much does your reading this correspond to clicking on advertisements? Which kinds of advertisements? Specific to you and changing as you change. And so I can optimize your newsfeed very different than I would optimize this guy's newsfeed or her newsfeed, right? And with a lot more interactive data. And then as I start wanting to add more things, right now, if I'm Google, I want to get your email, and I want to get your calendar, and I want to try and get some shopping and some search and whatever, and be able to use that. If I'm Facebook, I want to start putting on Marketplace, and I want to pay attention to Messenger, and all these types of things. So, and then I want to have lateral application of all of that data for maximizing time on site in the competition for your attention that we're monetizing. So social media is simply taking the types of dynamics that were always the case and just ratcheting up attention hijacking and disinformation and those types of phenomena with exponential information and narrative tech. So we're getting exponential disinformation, right? We can find the disinformation and the attention hijacks that you are maximally susceptible to.